Every pilot who has ever sat in a pre-mission brief has been given an adversary profile. The profile tells them what is out there, how it performs, and how to counter it. The assessment is built from decades of accumulated intelligence, radar emissions captured by signals intelligence aircraft, radar cross-section measurements taken by dedicated sensor systems, performance data inferred from technical collection and defector accounts, and the operational behavior observed in every previous engagement where the assessed platform was present. A mature adversary profile for a known platform, the Su-35, the J-20, the MiG-31, is a document dense with specific numbers and specific procedures. It is the accumulated product of every time that platform has been in the electromagnetic spectrum. A first-time encounter with an unknown platform produces none of this. There is no adversary profile. There is the aircraft's design philosophy inferred from its public appearance, the manufacturing nation's engineering traditions extrapolated from known comparable platforms, and the specific details that the collection systems were able to gather in the first seconds of the encounter. Everything else the pilot builds from observation in real time, under operational conditions, with the full tactical complexity of a live engagement providing the context. At 7:19 a.m. over the eastern Mediterranean, the F-35 C-section encountered a contact that had no mature characterization data in the database. The Sentry had been tracking the contact since 7:09 a.m. when it appeared on the APS-145 radar at 24,000 feet, bearing 097 from the Hmeimim airbase approach corridor. Not from the Hmeimim runway. From a bearing 6 degrees south of the main runway axis, consistent with a southern dispersal apron that satellite imagery had shown under construction for the previous 8 months, but had not yet confirmed as operationally active. The contact was climbing at a rate consistent with a high-performance jet aircraft on military power, 7,200 feet per minute. Speed, 410 knots and increasing. The characterization had been running for 10 minutes and had produced a result that the Sentry's tactical controller described to the F-35 C-section lead with specific emphasis on 2 words: unknown platform. The radar cross-section values were small, smaller than the Su-57 contacts that the section had observed on previous rotations. The initial returns had placed the RCS in the range of 0.02 to 0.04 square meters, values that, if accurate, were in the same category as the F-35C's own frontal aspect performance, small enough to create genuine characterization difficulty at extended range. The Sentry's APS-145 was building intermittent tracks rather than continuous ones, dropping the contact every 3 to 4 radar sweeps and reacquiring within 1 or 2 sweeps. At 140 nautical miles, the contact was at the edge of reliable tracking for a target with this cross-section. The emission profile was the second anomaly. The contact was not emitting any radar signature consistent with any known Russian fighter type in the database. No N019 Topaz, no IRBISE, no N036 Bielka, nothing. The contact was approaching the eastern Mediterranean airspace with its radar in standby or in a mode below the EW suite's detection threshold. A contact that was approaching without emitting was either conducting passive navigation, possible but operationally unusual for a tactical fighter, or was operating a radar in an LPI mode that the EW suite had not encountered before and was therefore not recognizing as a radar. At 7:19 a.m., the Sentry's controller made the assessment that the intelligence community would spend the next 48 hours refining the contact's radar cross-section, altitude, speed, departure geometry, and emission profile were consistent with the Sukhoi Su-75 Checkmate. The first operational appearance, if the assessment was correct, of a platform that had been publicly unveiled at the MAX Air Show in 2021, and that Russian defense officials had described as intended for export with a unit cost competitive with the F-35. Whether the claims made at air shows corresponded to the actual operational characteristics of the aircraft in flight was a question that every intelligence analyst who had reviewed the Su-75 specifications had been waiting to answer. This was the first opportunity to begin answering it. The F-35 C-section received the assessment at 7:19 a.m. and 41 seconds. The lead's response was the one the situation required. Hold passive approach, maximize EW collection, do not assume. Do not assume was the operationally critical instruction. The temptation in an unknown platform encounter was to map the new contact onto the closest known reference, in this case, the Su-57. The Su-75 was publicly stated to be a lighter, more affordable counterpart to the Su-57 with different design priorities. Whether its actual radar cross-section, sensor architecture, and performance envelope resembled the Su-57 enough to justify applying the Su-57 intercept protocol was exactly the kind of assumption that would cause the section to misread the engagement. The Su-75 might be better than the Su-57 in some respects and worse in others. The only way to know was to observe. At 7:21 a.m., the AN/APG-81 passive mode was building the electromagnetic portrait of the contact at 118 nautical miles. The portrait was sparse. The contact still showed no radar emissions, and the passive picture was being built primarily from the contact's radar cross-section returns from the Sentry's APS-145 relay, rather than from any emissions the EW suite could directly characterize. The RCS returns were intermittent but pointed at a specific size, 0.02 to 0.05 square meters, depending on the aspect angle as the contact maneuvered. The aspect-dependent variation was itself information. The RCS profile across aspect angles tells an analyst something about the airframe's stealth shaping philosophy. An aircraft that maintains very low RCS across all aspect angles, like the F-35C's near omnidirectional low observable design, shows small variation in RCS with aspect. An aircraft that achieves very low frontal RCS at the cost of higher side and rear aspects shows large variation. The Su-75's observed RCS range from 0.02 at what appeared to be its frontal aspect to 0.05 at a side aspect suggested a platform that had invested in frontal stealth at the expense of omnidirectional stealth. The design philosophy was consistent with a first-generation, fifth-generation aircraft, making the same trade-off that the J-20 had made: good from the front, less optimal from the sides. That inference was provisional. The data was 6 minutes old and based on a small sample of RCS measurements from a single aspect geometry, but it was the beginning of a contact model. The lead was building it as the section approached. At 7:23 a.m., the contact descended. From 24,000 feet to 18,000 feet, nose down, speed increasing through 510 knots. The descent had the character of an aircraft configuring for a different tactical phase, not the climb of a platform establishing altitude advantage, not the cruise of a platform maintaining fuel efficiency. The descent was purposeful. Either the pilot was responding to a tactical directive from a ground control element, or the pilot had identified something in the airspace below 24,000 feet that warranted closer attention. At 7:23 a.m., the Sentry identified what that something was: the P-8, a maritime patrol aircraft that had been operating at 18,000 feet, 40 nautical miles south of the F-35 C-section's current position, for the past 2 hours and 14 minutes. The Su-75's descent to 18,000 feet placed it at the P-8A's altitude, on a bearing that intersected the P-8A's racetrack in approximately 11 minutes at the contact's current speed. The tactical architecture was recognizable from multiple previous engagements, but the specific capabilities of the intercepting aircraft were not known. The lead could not assume that the Su-75's engagement envelope against the P-8A was identical to the Su-57s or the J-20s or any other platform that previous engagements had established protocols for. The P-8A's crew of 9 was the constant. The unknown was the platform they were facing. At 7:24 a.m., the first emission appeared on the EW suite's passive display.
Not a radar. A data link signal, compressed, encrypted, brief. Duration, 0.4 seconds. Frequency, not consistent with any known Russian military data link architecture in the database. The frequency and modulation pattern were consistent with a narrowband burst transmission of the type used for position reporting between stealth aircraft operating in a formation where radar silence was maintained. The Su-75 was not talking to the ground. It was talking to something else in the airspace.
The EW suite had not found the other element. The contact was part of a formation that had a second member somewhere in the sector. At 7:24 a.m. and 41 seconds, the lead transmitted to the Sentry. Sentry, Falcon lead. Unknown contact has transmitted on an unrecognized data link frequency. Assess possible second element in sector. Expanding passive search. The Sentry's response was immediate. No additional contacts detected. The Sentry's picture was clear except for the one confirmed contact in the section. The second element, if it existed, was either outside the Sentry's detection range, below the radar horizon, or was producing an RCS below the APS-145's detection threshold from the current geometry. All three possibilities were operationally significant. The third possibility, a second Su-75 below the Sentry's detection threshold, was the most concerning because it meant the same geometry that had allowed the first Su-75 to approach intermittently tracked might be hiding a second aircraft entirely.
The first friction event at 7:25 a.m. was the emergence of the second contact, not from a new bearing, from the same bearing as the first contact, but lower. 6,200 feet, bearing 097, range 106 nautical miles. The second Su-75 had been flying below the Sentry's radar horizon at low altitude and had climbed into the detection geometry when the first contact's approach had drawn the section's passive scan toward the sector. The second contact was at 6,200 feet, speed 440 knots, heading 183 south toward the P-8A's position from a lower altitude and a slightly different bearing.
2 Su-75s. One at 18,000 feet on a northwest to southeast approach. One at 6,200 feet on a north to south approach. Different altitudes, different bearings, converging on the P-8A's position from geometries that would arrive within approximately 3 minutes of each other. The Liaoning had used this architecture. The PLAAF had used variants of it. Now the Russian Air Force, with an unknown platform, was using a coordinated two-contact low-high approach toward an American non-combatant patrol aircraft. The architecture was the same. The platform was new. At 7:25 a.m. and 31 seconds, the high Su-75, Contact 1, activated a sensor, not a radar. An infrared search and track system, similar in principle to the 8TK on the MiG-31, but operating at a significantly different sensitivity and frequency band. The IRST emission was passive in the sense that it transmitted no radar energy, but its own optical system's scanning mechanism produced a characteristic electromagnetic artifact that the EW suite detected as an infrared search signature. The IRST was sweeping the sector containing the P-8A's position. An infrared search and track system at 18,000 feet, in the current atmospheric conditions over the eastern Mediterranean, had a detection range against a large multi-engine aircraft like the P-8A of approximately 60 to 80 nautical miles. The P-8A was 42 nautical miles from Contact 1's current position, inside the IRST's detection envelope. The P-8A's 4 Rolls-Royce engines were producing an infrared signature that the IRST would resolve as a target within the next 2 to 3 sweeps. The IRST changed the tactical calculus in a specific way. A radar-guided intercept could be disrupted by jamming the radar. An IRST-guided intercept could not be disrupted by radar jamming. If the Su-75 was configured to use the IRST for target acquisition and an infrared missile for terminal guidance, the same combination the J-20 had used in the Typhoon engagement, then the jamming options available from the EA-18G, which was not in this sector, were not available. What was available was the F-35C's own approach. The lead went to full APG-81 tactical power at 7:25 a.m. and 59 seconds. The decision was not about establishing a fire control solution. The fire control solution on Contact 1 had been building in LPI mode since 7:21 a.m. and was at 61% confidence, still below threshold. The decision was about communication. Full power at this moment told the Su-75 crew that the electromagnetic environment had changed, that an actively tracking aircraft was present, and that the IRST-based approach geometry was now operating in a context where a responding interceptor had identified them, had a partial fire control solution, and was closing. The Su-75's response to the full-power APG-81 activation was the most operationally valuable data point of the entire engagement. The onboard radar activated, not in fire control mode. In what the EW suite characterized, after 2.4 seconds of analysis, as an LPI search mode. The emission was at a frequency and with a pulse pattern that did not match any known radar in the database. The frequency band was consistent with AESA technology. The pulse characteristics were consistent with a system designed to detect aircraft in a heavy electronic warfare environment. The LPI quality of the emission, its spectral characteristics, its power distribution, its detection probability from the F-35C's passive sensors, was the EW suite's primary output after the 2.4-second characterization window.
LPI quality assessment. The Su-75's radar was operating at a LPI standard that was between the Kibini-equipped Su-35S and the N036 Bielka on the Su-57. Not as sophisticated as the N036's LPI mode, but significantly better than the Irbis-E on the Su-35S. A LPI standard that placed it solidly in the 5th-generation performance category. Not the 4.5 generation capability that some assessments had assigned to the Su-75's export market positioning. The second data point, the Su-75's radar had not found the F-35C. The 2.4-second LPI search sweep had not produced any behavioral change from Contact 1 that would indicate a target acquisition. The Su-75's radar, operating at LPI mode, had searched the sector containing the F-35C and had not resolved it as a target at 74 nautical miles. Whether this was a detection threshold result, the Su-75 couldn't find the F-35C at this range, or a processing time result. The Su-75 hadn't dwelled long enough for its algorithm to separate the F-35C from background, could not be determined from the passive picture alone. Both possibilities were entered into the mission data recorder. At 7:26 a.m., the lead transmitted on guard. Unknown. Russian military aircraft, bearing 097. You are approaching a U.S. Navy non-combatant aircraft. You are being tracked by U.S. Navy aircraft in fire control mode. Reverse course immediately. The guard transmission was simultaneously an operational deterrent and an intelligence collection event. The Su-75 crew's response to the transmission would tell the section things about the aircraft's behavioral protocol, its crew's training, and the tactical confidence the Russian Air Force had invested in the platform. The response came in 9 seconds. Both contacts turned simultaneously. Contact 1 turned south-southeast, away from the P-8A's bearing. Contact 2, at 6,200 feet, turned northeast. The turns were coordinated to within less than 2 seconds of each other.
which meant the two pilots had a common radio circuit on which the guard transmission had been received by both and had a pre-briefed response to a guard transmission from an intercepting aircraft that they executed together without an additional coordination delay.
9 seconds. 2 coordinated turns. Pre-briefed response to guard from an unknown geometry interceptor.
The behavioral data was being logged. At 7:27 a.m., Contact 1's radar deactivated. The LPI emissions ceased. The IRST continued its sweep for 11 more seconds, then also ceased. The Su-75 was going home with its sensors in standby mode, the same electronic discretion that had characterized its approach. A platform that had launched, transited, operated, and recovered in near electromagnetic silence, producing only the brief data link burst, the IRST sweep, and the 2.4-second LPI search as its entire active emission profile. Contact 2 had also gone to standby. Both Su-75s were egressing east at Mach 0.92, climbing back through 18,000 feet on their return to Hmeimim. The P-8A completed its patrol track and recovered normally. At 7:29 a.m., the lead transmitted. Sentry, Falcon lead. Both unknown contacts egressing east, bearing 097 and 093, range 89 and 82, in standby. Platform identification, unconfirmed, assess Su-75 class. EW collection package substantial. Transmitting data burst to CAOC. Fuel state bingo plus 19. RTB available. The data burst was 14 minutes of the most operationally valuable electronic intelligence collected on a Russian fifth-generation platform since the first Su-57 encounter. Not mature intelligence. Not a complete platform characterization. The beginning of one. The EW Suite's recordings contained the Su-75's RCS profile across 4 aspect angles, the data link frequency and modulation pattern, the IRST signature, and the LPI radar's spectral characteristics. Each of those was a parameter that had previously been estimated from public data, manufacturing tradition, and design extrapolation. They were now measured values from an operational encounter. The debrief ran 4 hours and 26 minutes, the longest of the rotation. The primary discussion was not tactical. It was characterization. What did the collected data say about the Su-75's actual capabilities relative to the specifications that had been publicly described and the assessments that had been built from them? The first finding was the RCS profile. The Su-75's frontal RCS of 0.02 to 0.04 square meters was better than the most optimistic pre-encounter assessment and significantly better than the export market positioning would have suggested. The side aspect RCS of 0.05 to 0.08 was consistent with a first-generation stealth design that prioritized frontal performance. The data supported a characterization of the Su-75 as a genuine fifth-generation platform for BVR engagements from the frontal aspect, not a 4.5-generation compromise as some assessments had suggested. The second finding was the LPI radar. The EW Suite's characterization placed the Su-75's LPI quality between the Su-35S and the Su-57. Better than a 4th-generation platform, but below the Su-57's N036. The practical implication, the Su-75's radar would be detectable by the AN/ALQ-218 at shorter ranges than the N036, but the difference was meaningful enough to require a specific intercept protocol rather than applying the legacy flanker protocol. The third finding was the data link frequency. The burst transmission had occurred on a frequency that matched no known Russian military data link standard. Whether this represented a new Russian military communication standard being operationally tested, a classified version of a known standard operating on an unallocated frequency, or a deliberate use of a non-standard frequency to complicate NATO electronic intelligence collection, was not determinable from the single 0.4-second burst. The frequency was logged, flagged, and transmitted to the signals intelligence community for analysis. The fourth finding was the one that would require the most work to answer. The Su-75's LPI radar had not found the F-35C at 74 nautical miles in a 2.4-second dwell. The detection probability bound established by this single event was: the Su-75's LPI radar cannot reliably detect an F-35C at 74 nautical miles frontal aspect in a 2.4-second dwell in this atmospheric geometry. What it could do with more dwell time, at different ranges or from different aspects, was not answered by this engagement. The debrief recommended additional collection before using this single data point as a planning bound for future engagements. The intelligence product that left the carrier that afternoon was 14 pages. The first page was marked with a single notation in the header that reflected both the significance of the encounter and the appropriate humility about what one engagement could establish. The notation read, "First contact, preliminary assessment only. Do not plan against these values without corroboration. 2 Su-75 contacts. 1 F-35C section. 1 P-8A with 9 crew. 14 minutes of EW collection. 1 data link burst on an unrecognized frequency. 1 LPI radar activation, 2.4 seconds. F-35C not detected. 1 IRST sweep P-8A acquisition probability, probable. Ordnance employed, 0. Platform characterization before this engagement, estimate only. Platform characterization after, preliminary measured. Time to mature characterization, estimated 18 to 24 months of additional collection. The Eastern Mediterranean at 8 a.m. was unchanged. The Sentry maintained its orbit. The P-8A was in the recovery pattern. The 2 Su-75 contacts had crossed back into Syrian airspace at 7:41 a.m. and had descended toward Hmeimim on a standard recovery bearing. At some point in the next 24 hours, the Russian Air Force's mission debrief would assess what had been accomplished. The Su-75 had been observed. It had been engaged by a guard frequency. It had been tracked, or had it. The F-35C's fire control solution had not crossed the employment threshold. Whether the Su-75 crews knew they had been tracked by an active fire control radar was determinable from the guard transmission but not from any other collected indicator. The guard said, "You are being tracked." The APG-81 data said, 61% confidence, below threshold. The Su-75 pilots would debrief what they had experienced. The F-35C pilots would debrief what they had collected. Both debriefs would shape what happened the next time. There would be a next time. The southern dispersal apron at Hmeimim was now confirmed as operationally active.